Does scripture say anything about the multiverse?
When I first encountered the multiverse, I originally thought, okay, this is just something I don't have to pay too much attention to. It's science fiction.
Welcome, dear viewers, to another episode of Reasons Podcast. Today I'm joined once again by Dr. Jeff Zweerink, an astrophysicist, and today we are talking about the multiverse. You know, there seems to be an increasing evidence for the existence or the practicality of the multiverse in many, many ways. And many scientists have actually come up with questions like, if the multiverse is true, maybe we don't need a God to create the particular universe that we are living in. So to help us understand what the multiverse is, we're going to have this conversation. So Jeff, I just want to understand, I'm not a student of physics. So, you know, I've been watching a lot of Marvel Universe, DC Universe, where, you know, this multiverse seems to be one of the great themes in these Marvel, comics. But just help us understand what the multiverse is all about.
You know, that's a great question. And you look through the culture and throughout a lot of film franchises and comics and books and everything, the multiverse is just there. The idea that it's a scientific idea is interesting. And I have to say, one of my favorite things when I started getting ready to started getting talks ready for the multiverse, I thought, do what any good person does, go out on Google, what is the multiverse? And one of my favorite things came up. It's got a dad and a daughter sitting on the bed. Dad's tucking the daughter in, they're reading stuff, and the daughter turns to the dad and he goes, "Dad, what's the multiverse?" And he goes, "Why, it's a plot device for lazy writers." It's surprising how true that is, but that doesn't really help us here today. So from the perspective of a multiverse, I mean, obviously multiverse, you got to figure out what a universe is first. And you might think that's easy to define, but it turns out it's kind of hard. But we know from looking at scientific data of this universe that this universe is about 14 billion years old, and it has a speed of light, which is the maximum velocity something can move through space. And so that actually gives us some tools to define a universe, at least in an objective way, so that then you can say, all right, the multiverse is really just anything beyond that. So the way I would describe it is this. When I look at the moon is roughly 200,000 miles away, and light travels at roughly 200 miles per second. 200,000 miles away, 200,000 miles per second, which means when I'm looking at the moon, I'm seeing it as it appeared 1 second ago. Okay, let's move out a little further. You go to the sun, it's about 8.5 minutes. You go to the Andromeda galaxy, it's 2.5 million light years. So it takes light 2.5 million years to get here, which means I'm seeing it as it appeared 2.5 million years ago. We go out to distant galaxies where light's been traveling for 12 billion. Go out to the cosmic microwave background radiation, and it's been traveling towards us for 14 billion years. To get any further away, light doesn't have time to get from that region to Earth. So we can say, all right, the universe is the most distant reaches, or the most distant locations where light has had time to travel to the Earth. Very big reason, but then with that as the definition for the observable universe, Hubble volume, it goes by various names. Yeah. The multiverse just now becomes anything beyond that. It could be like Star Wars. You go out there and it's just a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. You get out to the edge of the observable universe, probably looks pretty similar to what we see. Or maybe there are other realms where the laws of physics might look different. There's a way to get a quantum mechanical multiverse. So these are some of the ideas that are out there of what a multiverse is.
That's very interesting because, things like the multiverse seems to be very sci-fi.
It does.
And like I mentioned, the Marvel comics, and it really gets the imagination of people. So I'm just wondering, as an astrophysicist, you must have looked at the stars and, look at the possibility of the multiverse being there. So I just want you to clarify, is this thing called the multiverse, is it just science fiction? Or could it be a possibility where we have good scientific evidences?
Yeah, so in terms of any sort of movie or book or whatever series, the multiverse there's some capacity to travel through it. And that part is indeed science fiction. There's no capacity, even if a multiverse does exist from a science perspective. The idea of us being able to travel to these other realms, that is science fiction. But I will say this, so Big Bang cosmology is a very it's a phenomenal description of the universe in which we live. And it describes how our universe starts in this hot, dense state. It cools down. As it cools down, it gives off the cosmic microwave background radiation. Stars, galaxies, planets form. And eventually you get our solar system, the Earth, human, all of the life, and then ultimately humans. Great description of how things work in this universe. But in order to explain the cosmic microwave background radiation, for instance, it is the same in every direction. It's the same temperature. There's the geometry of our universe. There are these features where if you just say our universe is all there is, we don't have a good explanation and they look weird. And so one way scientists come and said, hey, if our universe experienced this epoch of inflation very early in its origin or in its history, then that would explain why the universe has the geometry. Why does the cosmic microwave background radiation have the temperature it has? If inflation happened, our universe is far larger, or what exists is far larger than what we can see in our universe. So if inflation happens, we live in this kind of Star Wars or level 1 type multiverse where there's just more stuff out there than what we can see. And even more than that, we try and figure out how would inflation work. So we develop various mechanisms and say, all right, can we measure that? Now we can't measure which mechanism works, but in a very generic sense, all of these mechanisms produce these other realms where the laws of physics might be different too. So the way I say it, scientifically speaking, if inflation happened, we live in this level 1 multiverse. If our mechanisms for inflation are correct, we live in a level 2 multiverse. So yeah, I think the multiverse really is a scientific idea. It's not completely fleshed out, but it's not science fiction either.
So what you're seeing is that, there are these parallel universes where in another universe, you and I could be having the same conversation. So is that the real scenario? Maybe in that world, so to speak, in this universe, you're the astrophysicist. But in another universe, I could have been the astrophysicist and the conversation could be going, the other way around. So would that be a possibility or?
Those are the ideas that are thrown around because, again, there's a couple of subtle distinctions in there, but that's a great question because in the multiverse, basically what it says is that anything that's possible, anything that could happen does happen somewhere. Now, so that's the question. Specifically you asked about, could we be reversed? Well, now you have to ask the question, is Zuala and is Jeff just an arrangement of atoms? Because if we're just an arrangement of atoms, somewhere in the multiverse, that arrangement's going to happen. In fact, not only somewhere, it's going to happen a whole lot of times as well. So if we're just physical beings and there is no spiritual component, then yes, there would be multiple copies of Jeff Zweerink and Zuala out there, and any possible outcome would have happened. It doesn't say anything could happen, but any possible outcome will happen.
All right.
And so these are some of the weird things that come up if you look at a multiverse in just a naturalist perspective. You end up in this scenario where everything we see is just got to be physical. And that means that it can be replicated, and the multiverse is going to be littered with copies of everything we see here on Earth, which I think is a little bit of a troubling concept.
So that means that this universe that we are living in, as philosophers would say, could be the best of all possible worlds.
Well, it raises that possibility, and again, it depends on whether we're talking about this from a naturalist perspective or a theistic perspective. In a naturalist perspective, there's no sense in which you could say we live in the best of all possible worlds, because this scenario, it may be incredibly improbable, but in the multiverse, it's going to happen many times over. So even if we're the best of all the possible, there's still a whole lot of us out there. And it may well be that there's better ways things can be put together and we just don't know. So in a naturalist, you've got a problem. In a Christian world or a theistic worldview, there are some other things that play into that. And I think those theistic implications actually help make the multiverse a usable scientific tool.
That's very interesting because if there are those possibilities, many scientists would actually argue, ultimately we might not need a creator. So does the multiverse actually do away with God?
So the way I would look at it is, or the framework that I have to think about that is, okay, if I'm a naturalist and I want the multiverse to get rid of for God, what needs to happen? And I've got a couple of constraints. One, it needs to actually just be a naturalist model, that there's nothing other than the physical, and it's got to be scientific. And so there's a set that leads to some criteria. If for the naturalist to say, there's no need for God, there can't be a beginning to the multiverse, and there can't be design in the multiverse. Because if there's a beginning and there's design, we're back to there being a beginner and a designer, just like we see in this universe. Your mechanism for producing a multiverse must be able to produce sufficient variety to explain our universe, and it also must have a way that you could test it and figure out whether it's right or wrong. So that's a scientific criteria. If it can't explain our universe, then it's not scientific. If it can't be testable, it's also not scientific. And I think, and this is another way of saying that there's design or a beginning, that there's something more than just the natural, is that means that all life, specifically human life, must be purely physical. In other words, Zuela, you are just an arrangement of atoms. Jeff Zweerink, just an arrangement of atoms. Because if there's anything more, then you have something, the naturalist plus something, and that means the naturalist model is incorrect. And so I find that sort of idea, now if you're looking at that, so now you've got this criteria. Is there a beginning and is there design? And so that's a great question to ask about the multiverse. And it turns out when you investigate like these inflationary multiverse models, it looks like there's still a beginning and it looks like there's still design. Now it plays out a little differently than in Big Bang cosmology, but nonetheless they still do appear, that evidence for a beginning and evidence for design still shows up even in a multiverse.
Wow, that's amazing. And so if there is a creator and a designer, that would leave us with the final question. That is, if this designer is the God of the Bible, does Scripture say anything about the multiverse?
When I first encountered the multiverse, I originally thought, okay, this is just something I don't have to pay too much attention to. It's science fiction. Because I recognized it has a lot of potency to explain the evidence for Christianity, for God. Because, if the multiverse is true, so inflationary Big Bang cosmology, basically the way you produce a Big Bang or our universe in inflation is inflation by nature just expands very rapidly. It decays to something closer to the ground state, and inside that bubble you get our universe. So there's a beginning, that boundary of that bubble is the beginning, but that's not just going to happen one place, it's going to happen multiple places. So maybe the beginning in our universe is just like Sunday. It's the beginning of the week, but there's one before, there's one next week, one this week. Similarly with design, there's an argument that plays out because most of the fine-tuning is put in terms of probabilities. So if things are really improbable in a single universe, that matters. But now if you've got this incredible sample size, it's all going to play out. So I began to realize, oh, wait, yeah, the multiverse could answer those. Now, as I investigated, it seems like there is a beginning and there's a designer. But now your question you ask, how does Christianity interact with this? And I thought, well, that can't be biblical. The multiverse, clearly, that can't be right. And then I just went and looked through Scripture. There's the physical realm in which we live, where we see the earth and all the stuff that goes on. But the Bible talks about an angelic realm that is separate from our physical realm. And so it's not physical, but it's an entirely different realm. Okay, so that's kind of like the new heavens and new earth. That's going to be a new physical spiritual realm. And so it occurs to me the Bible kind of talks like we live as part of a multiverse. Now, you see there's differences in what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the Bible saying, inflationary cosmology is right. But nonetheless, I find Scripture points to we live in a multiverse. There seems to be scientific evidence. Once again, what the Bible describes, what we find scientifically, they seem to line up really well.
Wow, and that's an amazing answer. So ladies and gentlemen, if you've liked this conversation that I'm having with Jeff has also written a book called Who's Afraid of the Multiverse, and it's available on Amazon, and you can go to rtbapac.in to get more information, and do visit www.reasons.org as well. With that, thank you so much, Jeff. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks, Loras.